Hi everyone, and welcome back to the garden. It is a beautiful day. I've actually been outside cleaning up the shed a little bit, trying to get prepared for spring. I wasn't intending to start this early, but I realized March is just around the corner, and typically I start a lot of my cleanup mid-March, but we're still having very unusual warm weather. Today it's in its mid-50s. We had a day in the low 70s this past week. So it's definitely pushing some spring perennials and some bulbs out of the ground extremely quickly. So I'm starting to get some of the woodland blend that I planted from Color Blends to bloom this past week, which is really nice to see those things that I put so much effort into in the fall coming to fruition. They'll be there for years to come. Now, one thing I want to mention is I have also noticed at the big box stores, Home Depot and Lowe's, that they already have out some of their shrubs, fruit trees, not shrubs in the sense of like 1 or 2 3-gallon shrubs, but the ones you see, the little hydrangeas and the clematises in the boxes, strawberries potentially. And what I'm going to say is don't be fooled if you live around me into buying those now unless you intend to pot those up and grow them on through spring or through the rest of winter. We still have at least 2 good months where it could freeze here. And if you put those things in the ground now, a lot of them are perennial, so they may be fine, but to the extent they have any tender green growth on them already from being in the warm stores, that could potentially kill them or definitely set them back. So don't be fooled, those things may die. What I've done in the past is I've purchased them later in the season. I haven't had the best luck with those plants anyway because they tend to sit there. They just arrived at the end of February. They'll sit there until we get our last freeze and they dry out really bad in their containers sometimes, or they'll kind of rot because too much moisture was provided at the packing facility, and then the roots just look really gross when you get them. So if you do decide to go ahead and purchase some of those things because you're like me and you're concerned someone else is going to get them before you, just make sure you preferably pot those up, keep them protected. Certainly you can set them out if we're having nice weather like we are today, but if it's getting below freezing, pull those into the garage or your basement and give them a little more protection until it warms up more consistently, because this is very much a false spring. Around here we typically give the all clear at Mother's Day, and typically I would say that's a little late, but just 2 years ago we had a late freeze and it got down to like 19 second week into May. So I'm a little more wary of putting things out earlier than I used to be, because we did have that happen. I'd already set out my peppers and had to cover lots of stuff in the vegetable garden because I got a little ahead of myself. So today what I wanted to talk to you about mostly is roses. There we go, that's better. A little more shade here. It's actually already super bright. Really used to in Ohio having really overcast days in the winter, so any sun this early in the year is a nice reprieve from the cloudy days. So let's just get into it. So little history of roses for me. My granddad always grew roses, both of my granddads did. When we moved into this house, there were, I think, 3 rose bushes. 2 of them were like the drift rose variety or the landscape rose. And then there was one that was a shrub type rose. And I pulled them out immediately because they were very disease prone. And they were located really poorly. There was one next to a hose bib on the side of the house, so it was really difficult to even turn the water on to water the garden. This was before I had the sprinkler system in effect, so I don't use that hose bib very much now, but it was just very poorly placed. They were also on the north side of the house, so they didn't get as much sun as they liked. And the shrub rose in the back was just a red rose, I think, and I just do not tend to love red roses in general. They're too much of a striking difference in the color palette that I typically plant in the garden, and they would stand out a little more than I'd want them to. They can look good in some other people's gardens. Red is just not my color palette. So after pulling out those roses probably 4 or 5 years ago now, I swore that I would never plant another rose in my garden ever again because I just didn't want the disease issues, having to spray them, all of those things that tend to come with some types of roses. About 4 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, I fell in love with this variety called At Last by Proven Winners, and it was my introduction into roses again. It was orange, a really pastel colored orange, and I really loved that variety, and I added a few to my garden. Now since then, I found that they don't do really great for me. They're beautiful, they smell really great, but they don't hold their petals very long. And so what I'm looking for in a rose is one that will bloom, but also hold its petals really well. Because what's the point in having a rose bush, in my opinion, if you cut the roses and they don't hold their petals and they just fall off in a couple days? So definitely look into the specific rose that you're getting. But after I found that at last, I kind of discovered David Alston, and I started buying a lot of their roses directly from David Alston. And some of them I've loved because they tend to be really beautiful, roughly roses. And some of those I have dug out the past year and maybe this year because they were not performing like I wanted them to. You know, last year I discovered Rose Rosette in my garden, and it was on a David Alston rose called Tranquility. One of my favorite roses is the Poet's Wife, which is a yellow rose that does really well, but I moved that one last year because it was getting a little too big and vigorous for me. So I tend to really love David Alston's roses, but they're not always bred for disease resistance, which is something that I don't want to have to spray a lot of things in my garden, treat a lot of things for bugs. So I have transitioned kind of away from David Alston over the past year after having some of the issues with their roses, but also if I purchase David Alston roses from David Alston directly, I've had on 2 occasions the wrong rose sent to me. They of course have great customer service and they will refund your money or replace the rose, but the issue with bare root roses is they only ship them in the spring, and by the time you discover that you received the wrong rose, it's too late. And so your only options for the fall are to get roses that were cuttings, so they're going to be a much smaller bush, or wait an entire another year to get the correct rose sent to you, hopefully. I'm not the only one that has experienced this. I've talked to some friends who have also received the incorrect roses from David Alston, and just kind of part of the bare root issue. They must have tagged them incorrectly, and then we received the incorrect rose. We plant it thinking it's going to be their correct rose, and it wasn't. So I just want to throw that out there. I'm no longer ordering directly from David Alston because of the issues I've had with ordering. Some people I'm sure have had amazing experiences, but if you've been watching the channel very much, you know I just tend to have really bad luck with shipped plants. But last year I stumbled upon 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲.com, and I really like their roses. They don't send bare root roses. They do cut and grow them on their own roots, which is a really great benefit if you live in a colder climate like I do. If those roses die to the ground, the roots of the plant match the top of the plant, and so it will come back the same plant. David Alston also sells some own root roses. A lot of their roses are grafted roses though, so the root stock of the plant is not necessarily the shrub of the plant that you will get. So in the event those die down, it's possible you will get different type rose come up, and it's a red rose typically, and sometimes you'll get offshoots from the root stock that you have to keep cut down. So there are pros to bare root roses and there are cons to bare root roses, and there are pros to own root roses, the main being that if you do get shoots from the roots of that rose, it's going to be true to the plant. They're not going to establish as quickly, so bare root roses tend to be really vigorous because they have several-year-old rootstock. Cut own root roses that are grown in containers are just going to take a little longer to get going, but in my experience over the past year with heirloom roses varieties, they've done really well. So I think I will look toward getting own root roses in the future. And I actually got a copy of Heirloom Roses catalog sent to me over the past couple weeks, and I want to go through it and show you a few that I'm really interested in that I've grown before and that I would probably recommend just taking a look at their catalog, ordering their catalog on their website if you can get it, because they have a really interesting foray here. It's like a rainbow, every color aligned in order. Let's go to the next page here, and you can see it starts from red and goes all the way through to white here at the back. And so you can see every shade of rose that they have available. And on the front, it says they have over 900 varieties. So I believe all of their roses are own root roses, and they grow them all and they actually have bred some, so some are specific to 𝗟𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏roses.com. One of those is the Impressionist, which is this beautiful coral pink yellow colored rose right here on this page. I planted this one. It's a climbing rose. This is one bred from Distant Drums as a parent plant, and Distant Drums is also a very beautiful colored rose, similar to this one that I also have in my garden from Heirloom Roses. They came really healthy last year. I'll put some footage on the screen of how they showed up, and I really was just impressed getting a plant shipped in that good of health, because sometimes you can get them and they're broken or they just did not survive shipment very well. They have done a really good job, I think, sending impressive specimens out when I have ordered. So this is Distant Drums right here. You can see it's the parent of the Impressionist. These are the colors that I kind of lean toward in my garden. Not sure how many more roses I'm going to be adding to my garden. My garden's getting pretty full, as you know, but there's always going to be a place here and there for a rose, I'm sure. And so this is where I kind of start leaning towards the roses in this catalog, because they are orange, yellow, and more of a coral color. And then we get into the yellows. Julia Child is a really popular one that I would probably recommend. Teasing Georgia is one I planted last year. It's a climbing rose that's going to be growing on my moon gate this year. I'm hoping I will actually get some nice blooms on it this year, because I planted these as en route roses, I think last April. It was one of the first things I planted in the ground last year. They took a little while to get going, but now they're halfway up the moon gate already, and I will probably trim them back just a little bit. We did have that really hard freeze, and some of the canes look a little rough, so I'm going to cut it back a little bit. But now that it's had a year to get established, I think it'll take off a lot this spring. A lot of my roses, because it's been so warm, I'm seeing buds on already. And this year they have a page of entire new introductions. Something I'm seeing in roses, which seems to be very beautiful in bouquets. I don't know how it would look in the garden, but are really muted colors. So you can see this very pale yellow. It kind of lends towards the brown color, but I'm seeing a lot of those, like this one's Honey Dijon, so it's kind of a Dijon color. I tend to like a little more pop of color, but like this Coco Loco is also really pretty. It's a muted pink. And those are some of the staff favorites that I have listed here. Now, one thing about Heirloom Roses is they do sell David Alston roses specifically. So they have a variety, including several that I have in my garden. Charles Darwin I actually removed last year. It was supposed to be, for me, a very yellow rose, and the picture actually here shows it yellow, but some roses act differently in different people's gardens. So for me, it was almost a white, light pink rose, and it wasn't, I didn't love it, and that could have been an issue where David Alston sent me the incorrect rose, because it didn't look anything like this in the picture. So like I told you on multiple occasions, I've had issues ordering directly from David Alston, so that may just be an instance of me getting the wrong rose. So I don't want to speak poorly about the rose because I've never seen it anywhere else in person to know if this is just something I've experienced in my garden or not. Lady of Shalott is one I want to specifically point out this year. I planted it last year, I believe it was. It may have been possibly the year before. And it gets massive. If you look directly on David Alston's website, they have it listed as a shrub rose and a climbing rose. Now, I watched a YouTube video last year because I was kind of wondering why my shrub version of Lady of Shalott was growing so big. And I found someone on a YouTube channel, I do not remember the name, but I wanted to repeat it for you. Apparently, David Alston, the shrub rose and the climbing rose is the same rose, and it depends on how you trim it as to whether it becomes a climber or a shrub rose. Now, I trimmed mine profusely, and it was super vigorous. I would probably never plant a Lady of Shalott intending it to be a shrub rose because it was just too vigorous, and I ended up having to move it last year. Not sure if it survived the move. It's looking pretty rough from that cold weather we had, but if it isn't, it's a beautiful orange rose, but it was just a little too big and vigorous for me in my garden that I wanted to keep on top of. But if you have the space for it, it's a really beautiful alternative to like Proven Winners At Last rose. It looks very similar, and the blooms last much longer than At Last does. Crown Princess Marguerite, which is right here, Margarita is also a really beautiful option as well. So a lot of these you see on the page here are some I've had. So Teasing Georgia's in my garden. 𝗟𝗶𝗸𝗲 is the one I removed last year for Rose Rosette. So I probably, Rose Rosette is not, no rose is immune from Rose Rosette, but since 𝗟𝗟𝗏𝗲 seem to be kind of susceptible in my garden, it's not one I would recommend. It's also one that I've had issues with. Since it's a white rose, it's really beautiful, but if you have overhead irrigation spray and it gets wet, the petals turn brown and it's not very pretty. So if you want one, I would make sure you stick it away from overhead water and kind of give it maybe some protection from the rain showers, because if it gets any rain on it, their blooms are going to turn kind of that mushy brown color that some white plants exhibit. This is a bigger picture of Coco Loco. You can see this muted pink, almost brown looking color that seems to be becoming really popular in bridal bouquets recently. So this is a newer variety, I believe. Looks really beautiful. It's a repeat blooming, zone 6 to 7, and it works well in pots. So what I really like about this catalog is it tells you the sizing, the color, the zones, and as well as how you can use this rose specifically. Now there's one in here that I want to point out because it might be one that I would like to add to my garden, and it's called State of Grace. Now it looks very similar to Distant Drums and the Impressionist, but that's the rose color that I'm looking for. So the yellow and pink, you can see it right here, very beautiful. It's one of the reasons I'm not adding a whole lot many more roses to my garden recently, because I tend to lean towards a specific color and I already have a lot of that color in here. Now let's talk a little bit about rose care. So roses are some of those things that can be really finicky. They can tend to get black spot really bad. Some are really susceptible to Japanese beetles if you have those issues in your garden. We had a really bad issue with Japanese beetles about 4 years ago, and since that time I've not seen a whole lot of Japanese beetles. They're here and there, but I've not seen like them overtake my garden like they have as a few years ago. So each year might be a little different and something you just have to watch out for. So now is about the time that I'm going to start pruning back my roses for spring. I need to come through and clip some of my landscape roses, and I may do some videos on that as the weather warms a little bit. So look out for that in the next couple weeks as we start getting into spring cleanup. So the shrub roses will be cut back pretty hard. I tend to cut them back pretty hard because if you don't, they become so vigorous in the spring that they'll grow really big, especially some of the David Austin varieties that I have. So cutting them back pretty significantly works well for me. For the landscape roses, a lot of the ones that I have were eaten down by bunnies this fall and winter, and so I have some that I'll need to trim back a little bit. And honestly, don't make that too difficult on yourself. I am going to take a hedge pruner, spray it down with alcohol, and trim each of them so I don't transmit any diseases. That's something I've had to focus on since I discovered Rose Rosette in my garden last year. Rose Rosette is highly transmissible from the mites. I will think and try and link that video where I went over Rose Rosette last year when I discovered it. So pruning practices are really important if you have a large number of roses in your yard, because all of them are susceptible to Rose Rosette. And once you get Rose Rosette in your garden, it can be transmitted from rose to rose through poor cleaning practices when you're pruning your roses. So I purchased a tiny handheld sprayer, like a water bottle mister, last year that I'm going to fill with alcohol, and you trim your rose and you spray down your tools really well after each rose you prune to prevent transmitting disease from one rose to the other. Now, as far as fertilization, I don't tend to use anything very specific. If you've been following along last spring, you know I pretty much use holly tone on a lot of things. I did use some rose tone last year, but it's because I had it left over from the year before. So half of my roses got rose tone, half of them got holly tone. All perform essentially the same, and that's because I have really high pH soil. And so the holly tone kind of brings some of that pH down a little bit and makes them a little happier for everything in my garden. So I tend to use holly tone as a general purpose fertilizer. But in general, I'm pretty fertilizer agnostic when it comes to fertilizers. In the fall, I actually found at Home Depot a sale on drift rose fertilizer. So I'm going to be scattering some of that. That's organic, and it's from Job's. I think it'll work fine. I'm not very specific on the brands that I use if I can get a good sale, and that's something I would recommend as well. Sometimes the blends of fertilizer are tailored towards specific plants, so there's some acidity elements in Holly-tone, but oftentimes you'll find if you look at the back on the NPK values that usually they're pretty close or the same. Something that you might want to make sure the fertilizer has is a big phosphorus value. So NPK, the middle number is phosphorus, and those numbers tend to push bloom growth. And so a high valued phosphorus level would be good for your roses in spring, specifically to get them up and blooming really quickly. And then in the fall, you can go sort something a little more generic. Now, as for this year, what I'm going to be doing with my roses, I transplanted several in the fall. So I'll probably just be giving them that Holly-tone or the Drift Rose fertilizer that I got on sale for a couple of dollars at Home Depot in the fall. This will be an interesting year to see how my roses perform because we did have that really cold weather between Christmas and New Year's, and I've noticed several black stems on my roses, which kind of indicates that they have died. So a lot of those roses are on-root roses, or I've seed buds below where it's not black, so they are putting back out growth perfectly fine. But this is going to be an interesting year because this is the coldest it has gotten in winter since I've started expanding my garden. So we'll see how a lot of the plants fared, and that'll be a good example to show you what might work well in your zone 6 or above garden depending on the weather. Thank you guys for joining me. We'll see how the weather permits future video making over the coming weeks. It's getting that time where at least it's kind of warmer in the afternoons so I can shoot some content, start cleaning up the garden a little bit, which I'm really anxious to do now that it's super nice outside. This is the perfect weather when I want to be out in the garden before it gets too hot. But stick around, and remember, in a world full of hate, be a light. Take care, everyone. Bye.